Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling one of history's most influential figures. But we're not just here for a biography. We're on a mission to understand something much bigger, the difference between a real person and the legend they become.
So, how do you even begin to do that? I mean, that's the big question for any historian, right? It's like you're a detective staring at a case file that's centuries old. And to show you how they do it, we're going to dive into the life of the Prophet Muhammad as our case study. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with the big problem, history versus memory. Then, we'll look at the actual evidence we have to work with. After that, we'll try to piece together a timeline, see how stories can morph into myths, check out what different experts think, and finally, try to figure out where the man ends and the legend begins. Okay, first things first. Before we can even start digging, we've got to get our terms straight. Because to solve this kind of puzzle, you absolutely have to understand the difference between two key ideas that are at the heart of, well, pretty much all of history. So what's the difference? Well, think of it like this. History is what we can prove with hard evidence from the time, like a dated receipt or a security camera. Memory, on the other hand, is the story people tell about what happened. It's the family legend that gets passed down, getting a little bigger and a little different with each retelling to fit what that community needs the story to be. All right, so now that we know what we're looking for, history, not just memory, let's open up the evidence locker. When you're investigating 7th century Arabia, the clues you've got basically fall into three main buckets. And right away, you hit a classic problem for historians. It's a real dilemma. On one side, you've got these Islamic sources. They are packed with details, but they were all written down 100, even 200 years after the fact. On the other side, you have non-Islamic sources. Now, these were written at the time, which is great, but they're usually super brief, sometimes pretty hostile, and they only give you a tiny peek. But it's not all just written texts. We also have our third category, physical stuff. Hard evidence. We're talking about things you can actually touch, rock inscriptions, coins with official slogans, even massive buildings. This stuff is gold for a historian. Why? Because it gives us solid anchors in time, giving us a verifiable timeline to hang everything else on. So what do you do with these three very different types of clues? Well, historians carefully layer them on top of each other. And when you do that, you can start to build a core timeline, like a historical skeleton. These are the big events that we can be pretty darn sure about. And this right here is that skeleton. Major moments like the move to Medina, taking control of Makkah, the year he died, and the beginning of the big Arab conquests, these are all confirmed by multiple sources. They show up in early Islamic memory and in those contemporary accounts from outsiders. That's a solid match. But what about all the other stuff? The stories about his childhood, his birth year, that first big revelation. Well, those details come only from those Islamic biographies written way, way later. Since there's no other evidence from the time to back them up, historians have to put a little asterisk next to them. They have a lower level of historical certainty. Okay, so if the historical skeleton is pretty sparse, where did all the meat come from? All those incredibly detailed stories we know today? The answer, it turns out, is in the time gap. That huge 200-year gap in storytelling. I mean, think about it. After Muhammad died, for more than 100 years, these stories were just passed down word of mouth. Imagine a game of telephone that lasts for a century. The first big biography doesn't show up for over 130 years. And the main collections of his sayings and actions, we're talking more than 200 years later. In all that time, the stories weren't just being remembered. They were being shaped to fit the needs of a huge, growing empire. So, given all this, late, detailed stories, early, brief accounts, and some hard physical evidence, how do you put it all together? Well, scholars don't all agree. Depending on how much weight they give to each piece of evidence, they've come up with a few different scenarios to explain who the historical Muhammad really was. And this basically breaks down into four main camps. You've got the traditionalist view, which says the Islamic sources are pretty much reliable. Then you have the revisionist school, which is much more skeptical. The memory/myth idea suggests most of the details are really about community belief, not history. But, most scholars today kind of land in the middle in what we're calling the compromise view. They say, yeah, there's a real historical core here, for sure, but a lot of the details were added on or embellished over the centuries.
Okay, so after sifting through all the evidence and looking at the different theories, what's the takeaway? What's the final verdict from our little investigation?
Well, here's what the evidence tells us loud and clear. First, Muhammad was a real person, a historical figure in 7th century Arabia. Second, we know he existed because even his non-Muslim contemporaries mention him. Third, we can see from things like coins and monuments that an ideology centered on him was already established within a single generation. That's incredibly fast. And finally, it shows that the stories we have today are a powerful mix of that core history and a whole lot of later storytelling and memory. And that gets us to this amazing quote. The idea is that the memory of the prophet wasn't some dusty old portrait. It was a living, breathing canvas, and for centuries, different generations projected their own highest ideals onto it. And that leaves us with one final big question. And this goes way beyond just this one historical figure. It makes you wonder about any great hero from the past, doesn't it? How much of their story is about the life they actually lived, and how much is about the story we needed them to be?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a truly monumental figure, Muhammad, the founder of Islam.
It's definitely one of the biggest challenges in historical scholarship.
Absolutely. I mean, his impact shaped an entire civilization. But here's the catch, the real methodological problem.
Yeah.
The main biographies, the detailed stories of his life, they were written down, compiled maybe a century, even more, after he died.
Right. So you have this figure who clearly changes history, but the history about him gets written down much later. It creates this gap.
A big one. So our mission, what we're trying to do in this deep dive, is to use the historical critical method, really try to dig into the evidence.
Exactly. We need to be rigorous, skeptical, but fair, and try to separate the man of history, Muhammad, who lived roughly 570 to 632 CE, from the memory of him. Because that memory wasn't static. It was evolving, being shaped, maybe even politicized for centuries, say from 630 right up to 900 CE.
It's like an archaeological dig, but for knowledge, peeling back the layers.
That's a great way to put it.
And the layers are pretty diverse. We're not just relying on the traditional Islamic sources, the Qur'an, the sīra, the hadith. We're bringing in other stuff too.
Crucial stuff, like non-Islamic chronicles written at the time, often by people who were, let's say, less than thrilled about this new movement, maybe even hostile.
Which makes their testimony interesting, right? Plus, we have the hard evidence, the physical stuff.
Material anchors, yeah. Inscriptions carved in stone, archaeology, and really importantly, coins. What the early state stamped on its money tells you a lot. Numismatics.
Okay. So the goal here is to give you, the listener, a kind of balanced evidence table. You'll see how scholars actually anchor historical events, like pinning them down with this external or material proof.
And crucially, you'll understand why those really rich, detailed stories, the narratives from the sīra and hadith, while totally essential for understanding the faith and tradition, why historians have to be critical. Look for theological motives, political angles, maybe later embellishments that crept in.
Right. So let's dig into that evidence stack. We have to start with the big challenge right away, that time gap in the Islamic sources themselves.
Yeah, when you look at the main Islamic narrative sources, you immediately hit this timeline issue. It's almost an inverse relationship.
How so?
Well, the sources that are closest in time to Muhammad's life, they actually contain the fewest explicit biographical details about him.
Okay.
And the sources that are packed with stories, anecdotes, details about his life, his campaigns, they're the ones written down much, much later.
So let's start with the earliest one, the Qur'an. It comes directly from his lifetime, right?
Yeah.
Received his revelations between, 610 and 632 CE.
Exactly. It's anchored right in that period. It's absolutely the closest document we have. That's its huge strength.
But not a biography.
But not a biography. That's the challenge for a historian looking for, what happened when. The Quran is primarily about theology, guidance for the community, law, spiritual exhortation.
It mentions the prophet, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. It refers to the messenger or events happening around him, but often in a sort of generalized way. It gives surprisingly few direct, explicit details about, say, his childhood, his family background, or even the nitty-gritty of specific battles. Not its main purpose.
Okay, so if the Quran is the core revelation but not the history textbook, where do all those famous stories come from? His early life, The details of the migration to Medina, the campaigns.
Right. That's where the sīra and Maghazi literature comes in. The sīra means life or biography, and that's where you get the full narrative arc. The Maghazi focuses specifically on the military campaigns.
But this is where the time gap starts opening up.
Dramatically. The earliest comprehensive sīra we actually possess, the one attributed to a scholar named Ibn Isa, well, we don't even have his original work. We only have it through later editors, most famously Ibn Hisham. And Ibn Ishaq himself died in 767 CE.
Wait, 767. Muhammad died in 632. That's
About 135 years later, minimum.
Wow. Okay. That's a massive gap. If you found a detailed biography of, I don't know, Queen Elizabeth written 135 years after her death, based only on stories people remembered, you'd be pretty cautious, wouldn't you?
You absolutely would. And these accounts, the sīra, they relied heavily on oral traditions passed down through generations. That means they almost inevitably reflect the concerns, the beliefs, the theological needs of the community that finally wrote them down.
So the people writing in, say, the 8th century under the Abbasid Empire, had different priorities than someone writing in 640.
Completely different. They were building a massive empire, establishing complex legal systems, trying to provide context for Quranic verses, solidifying the prophet's status. They needed precedence, legitimacy. It's just a very different project than contemporary reporting.
Can you give an example, like a specific story where you can kind of see a later theological motive possibly shaping it?
Sure. Think about some of the traditional stories about Muhammad's childhood before he received revelations. Like the story where angels supposedly came down and cleansed his heart when he was a boy.
Right, I know that one.
From a theological perspective, it makes perfect sense. It establishes his innate purity, his preparation by God to receive the final message. It serves a vital purpose in establishing his prophetic credentials. But purely as a historical event reported over a century later, it's the kind of detail historians would flag as likely shaped by later belief.
Okay. And if the sīra is already, 135 years removed, the hadith literature, the sayings and actions of Muhammad pushes that timeline out even further.
Oh, yeah. Much further. The hadith are absolutely fundamental to Islam. They form the basis for so much law, ritual, daily practice, ethics. They were circulating orally for a long, long time through the 7th and 8th centuries.
But the collections we have, the famous ones.
The canonical collections, the really rigorously compiled ones like the collections of Al-Bukhari or Muslim, they weren't finalized, codified, and widely accepted until the mid-9th century.
Mid-9th century. So we're talking the 850s, 870s.
Yeah.
That's over 200 years after Muhammad.
2 full centuries. Which means, for a historian, while this material is indispensable for understanding Islam as a religion and civilization, you have to approach it critically. You have to constantly ask, could this saying reflect a legal debate happening in the 9th century rather than a situation in the 7th? Is there potential for anachronism, for later ideas being projected back, or just embellishment to make a point stronger?
It makes sense. This massive reliance on later internal sources is precisely why getting corroboration from outside the tradition is so incredibly important for historians.
Exactly. And this is where we find some of our earliest and in some ways most powerful evidence for Muhammad's historical reality, these external accounts.
Written by people who weren't part of the movement.
Right. Often Syriac Christians, Byzantine officials, Armenians, people in Persia, people who are watching this new power explode onto the scene, often with, considerable alarm. They weren't trying to build up the prophet's image. They were just trying to understand what was simming them.
So their value is that they're contemporary, or very nearly contemporary.
Precisely. Their chronological proximity is key. They give us immediate external confirmation that, yes, there was this movement, yes, it had a leader associated with it, and yes, it was making a huge impact, sometimes within just a couple of years of Muhammad's death.
Okay, let's trace that. What's the absolute earliest mention we have?
That seems to be a Greek text called the Doctrina Jacobi. It's dated pretty reliably to 634 CE.
634. That's only 2 years after the traditional date for Muhammad's death. Incredible. What does it say?
Well, it's framed as a dialogue, supposedly in Carthage, between Jews, and one Jew talks about the Saracens and says a prophet has appeared among them. Then a Christian character comments on this prophet.
And what's the comment?
He calls him a false prophet. Why? Because the text says he comes with a sword and sheds blood.
Wow. Okay, so right there, 2 years after his death, you have external confirmation of, 1, a prophet figure leading the Saracens or Arabs, and 2, that his movement was immediately perceived as militant, associated with conquest.
Exactly. It wasn't just seen as some quietist spiritual thing. The military aspect was front and center from the very beginning in external eyes.
And we get similar reports from Syriac writers around the same time.
We do. Thomas the Presbyter, also writing around 634, just plainly states that the Arabs of Muhammad were out there devastating villages near Gaza.
So naming him directly.
Naming him directly. And then there's another text, maybe a few years later, 637, 640, the record of the Arab conquest of Syria. It confirms these groups, explicitly linked to Muhammad, were fighting the Romans, the Byzantines, and killing thousands.
Hold on. Fighting the Byzantines at Gaza in 634. I mean, that requires serious organization, doesn't it? Just 2 years after the founder's death?
It absolutely does. It tells you something profound about the state he must have left behind. It suggests the leadership transition, whoever took over, was smooth enough and the structure robust enough to launch major external campaigns almost immediately.
It implies he didn't just leave behind a spiritual following, but a functioning political and military entity.
Precisely. This rapid, coordinated expansion is maybe the single strongest piece of evidence for his success as a state builder. It wasn't just scattered raids, it was conquest on a grand scale, right away.
Okay, moving forward a bit, maybe into the 660s, we get more details from an Armenian bishop, Sabios.
Sabios is really interesting because he starts adding a bit more religious content from his perspective. He writes about a merchant named Mamet, clearly Muhammad, who preached the God of Abraham.
So connecting him to the Abrahamic tradition.
Yes. And Sabios mentions specific teachings forbidding things like carrion, wine, fornication. And he says Mamet urged his followers to seize the land promised to Abraham. So you get this external snapshot of the core message. Monotheism, Abrahamic roots, moral rules, and a territorial ambition.
And other chronicles confirm the scale of conquest.
Yeah. The Khuzestan Chronicle, from around the mid-7th century, talks about the sons of Ishmael, whose leader was Muhammad, conquering Persia and Syria, mentioning the defeat of the Sasanian army.
So taking all these external accounts together,
Right.
What's the baseline picture they paint?
They paint a clear picture. A leader named Muhammad emerged in Arabia. He created a powerful, unified movement. That movement was religiously motivated, emphasizing Abrahamic monotheism. And immediately after his death, around 632, this movement exploded out of Arabia and began the rapid conquest of the Byzantine and Persian territories. The basic historical kernel is undeniable, based on these near-contemporary, often hostile sources.
Okay, so the chronicles give us the narrative from outsiders looking in. Now let's talk about the physical evidence, the stuff the early Islamic State itself produced. Inscriptions on stone, coins. These are like anchors, right? That can't be easily changed later, like an oral story might be.
Exactly. This is the material or archival layer. It gives us hard, baitable evidence of the administration, the ideology, the chronology, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Take the Zuhair inscription.
That's it, fine.
It's dated 24 AH in the Islamic calendar. That translates to 644 CE.
It says 44, just 12 years after Muhammad's death. That's incredibly early. What does it say?
It's pretty simple, actually. It's a marker near a water source, and it says something like, "In the name of God, I, Zuhair, wrote this at the time Umar died in the year 420.
So it confirms the death date of the second caliph, Umar.
Independently confirms it, yes. But just as importantly, from a technical standpoint, it shows the Arabic script being used for official purposes, and it already includes some diacritical dots, the dots that distinguish letters like B from T or EF. That tells us written Arabic was developed enough for state administration very early on.
And there's another inscription from the same year related to the next caliph.
Right, the Uthman inscription, also 24 AH 644 CE. It mentions the succession of the son of Affan, which is Uthman, the third caliph, referring to him as commander of the believers.
So these aren't stories, they're like bureaucratic timestamps.
Pretty much. They show a functioning state, orderly transitions of power using a standard title for the leader, all within a dozen years of the prophet. It counters any idea that the early caliphate was just chaos or didn't really exist yet.
Okay, jump forward just a little bit. To 652 CE, there's an inscription from Jerusalem.
Yeah, Jerusalem 32. This one's fascinating because it shows the reach of that state into conquered territory. It's about some building work, and it explicitly invokes the protection of God and the guarantee of his messenger.
His messenger meaning Muhammad.
Clearly. And it names some prominent companions of the prophet overseeing the work. So, barely 20 years after his death, you have an established Islamic administration, citing Muhammad's authority, managing infrastructure in a major city like Jerusalem. That's solid proof of an organized polity.
That idea of the state solidifying its identity. We also see that happening on the coins, don't we? It's like watching an ideology being born in metal.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic tracker of public ideology. At first, the conquering Arabs mostly just used the coins that were already there. Byzantine copper coins, Persian silver grams, maybe they'd scratch a little Arabic phrase on them, like Bismillah, in the name of God.
Pragmatic, I guess.
Yes.
Keep trade flowing.
Probably. But then gradually, they start putting specifically Islamic formulas onto the coins as part of the official design. This is a big step. The earliest coin we know of that actually has Muhammad's name on it is a silver dram, probably from around 66 AH. That's 685 or 686 CE.
Okay, so 685. That's still over 50 years after his death. Why wait so long to put the founder's name on the money? Some scholars find that delay significant, right?
They do. Revisionist scholars sometimes point to that delay and ask, well, if he was central from day one, why isn't his name on the coins immediately? Maybe the initial focus was more tribal, or maybe they just wanted to avoid disrupting the economy with radically new coinage.
But by the 680s, something changes.
Definitely. By the 680s, especially during the Second Civil War between rival caliphs, the need to assert a clear, unified Islamic identity across the empire becomes paramount. The coins become propaganda.
An ideological statement stamped in silver.
Exactly. That first coin says, Bismillah Muhammad Rasulullah. In the name of God, Muhammad is the messenger of God. A few years later, around 689, you find a coin minted in Persia that says the same thing. Muhammad is the messenger of God, but written in Middle Persian script, showing they're asserting the core message but adapting the language locally.
And then comes the full declaration.
Then comes the full shahada, the testimony of faith. There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. By about 72 AH, or 691, 692 CE, we see transitional coins carrying this full statement. This signals the complete consolidation of a distinct public imperial Islamic identity declared on the state's most visible medium.
It's fascinating how the hard evidence, the inscriptions, the coins, confirms the existence of this unified state, the succession of leaders, the development of a specific ideology, all within a generation or two of Muhammad. It backs up the core story of rapid success, even if we have questions about the later narrative details.
Right, so we have this three-legged stool of evidence. The internal Islamic tradition, Qur'an, sīra, hadith, the external non-Islamic chronicles, and the material anchors, inscriptions, coins. That's the framework we have to use to try and piece together the historical Muhammad.
Okay, framework established. Now let's try to build the picture, piece by piece, being really clear about what's based on solid early evidence versus what comes only from those later narratives. Let's start where the narratives start, his early life.
And right away, the certainty level, historically speaking, drops significantly. We're in the medium to low certainty range here.
Why?
Because virtually everything we know about his early life, his birth in Mecca around 570 CE, being an orphan, working as a merchant for Khadija, receiving the first revelation in the cave of Hira around 610 CE when he was 40, all of that comes exclusively from the sīra literature written down 130 plus years later.
So beautiful foundational stories for the faith, but historically they lack contemporary corroboration.
Exactly. There's no mention of any of this in the Qur'an directly. And crucially, those early external sources we just discussed, the Doctrine of Jacobi, Thomas the Presbyter, writing in the 630s, they are completely silent about his first 50 years.
Their story only starts when he's already a leader of a powerful movement.
Precisely. For them, the historical Muhammad appears on the scene as a political and military force, seemingly out of nowhere. We have no external contemporary evidence for the Meccan period of his life or ministry.
Okay, so the point where historical certainty really starts to climb is later, when he makes that move to Medina, the Hijra, in 622 CE.
Absolutely. The Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Yathrib, which then becomes Medina, the city of the Prophet, is a high-certainty historical event. Multiple sources, both early strata within the Islamic tradition and the logic of the situation, point to it.
Why did it happen? The tradition says persecution in Mecca.
Persecution in Mecca seems very plausible. But also, critically, he and his followers were invited to Yathrib. The city was torn apart by feuds between its main Arab tribes, the Aus and Khazraj. They needed an outside arbitrator.
So the Hijra isn't just Muhammad fleeing danger, it's him stepping into a political role. It's the moment he becomes not just a preacher, but a leader, a statesman, a judge.
It's absolutely foundational. It's the birth of the Ummah, the unified community. It's year zero in the Islamic calendar for a reason. And the key piece of evidence for this political transformation, even though it's preserved in the later sīra, is the document known as the Constitution of Medina.
Tell us about that. What makes it so important for historians?
Even if the text we have might have been edited or compiled later, most historians accept that it reflects a genuine early agreement. It essentially outlines a treaty or a social contract for this new community in Yathrib, Medina.
What did it establish?
It brought together different groups, the Muslim immigrants from Mecca, Muhajirun, the Muslim converts in Medina, Ansar, and significantly several Jewish clans living in Medina. It declared them all to be one community, Umayyad, distinct from other people.
So uniting different factions under one umbrella.
Yes. And crucially, it stipulated that they would support each other against outsiders. And this is key, that any major disputes within the community had to be referred to God and to Muhammad for a final decision.
That establishes his authority as the ultimate arbiter, centralized power.
Exactly. It's concrete evidence, preserved textually, of him establishing a political structure that transcended old tribal loyalties and put him at the center. It lays the groundwork for the state that would emerge. ##C, the apex of leadership and rapid expansion.
Okay, so he establishes this base in Medina. Then what? Consolidation, military campaigns?
That's the next phase. The later sīra accounts are full of details about the key battles fought from the Medina base. Badr in 624, Uhud in 625, the Battle of the Trench in 627, the diplomatic maneuvering around the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in 628.
And again, the usual caveat applies. We treat the blow-by-blow details, the speeches, the miraculous elements in these sīra accounts with caution because they're written later.
Right. The specifics are filtered through generations of storytelling and theological reflection. But the core fact that Muhammad successfully led military campaigns, defeated rivals, and consolidated control over the Hijaz region, that has to be accepted as historical.
Why? Because of the outcome.
Because of the undeniable outcome. You simply cannot explain the massive, unified Arab armies that burst out of Arabia in the 630s unless someone had successfully unified the region politically and militarily just before that. The effect demands a cause, and the Sīra's basic outline of consolidation fits that. This process culminated in the conquest or taking of Mecca in 630 CE.
Mecca, his hometown, the religious center. How is that event portrayed?
The sīra often emphasizes it was relatively bloodless, lots of clemency shown by Muhammad. It does, and that emphasis on mercy likely reflects, again, later ideals shaping the narrative. Establishing Muhammad as the perfect ruler, magnanimous in victory. The historical reality might have been more complex, but the political result is what matters for history. Mecca submitted. The Kaaba, the central shrine, was cleansed of idols, and Muhammad's authority was supreme.
Uniting the religious and economic heartland.
Which was essential for launching the next phase, the expansion beyond Arabia.
And then his death. The traditional date is June 8, 632. How certain are we about that?
Very high certainty, because it aligns perfectly with what happens immediately afterwards, as recorded in those external sources.
Explosion of conquests.
Exactly. It's the timing. The fact that just 2 years later, in 634, organized Arab armies under his banner are fighting the Byzantines deep in Syria, and by 636, they're invading Persia. That rapid, massive mobilization only makes sense if a powerful, unifying leader had just recently passed the reins to a successor structure that was ready to go.
So the sheer speed and scale of the conquests immediately after 632 act as a powerful confirmation of his historical impact and the state he built.
Absolutely. The historical Muhammad isn't just a prophet. He's demonstrably a successful state builder and military strategist who fused religious authority with political power, leaving behind an entity capable of changing the world map almost overnight.
Okay, so we have this historical kernel. The prophet, the move to Medina, the creation of a state, the unification of Arabia, the explosion of conquests immediately after his death, all anchored by external and material evidence.
Right. The basic facts are solid.
Now we need to shift focus to what happened after 632. How did that historical kernel get elaborated, standardized, polished, maybe even altered over the next 2 to 3 centuries? This is the process of memory formation, how the emerging empire shaped the story of its founder to meet its own needs.
And one of the very first steps in that process involved the foundational text itself, the Qur'an, ##A, standardizing the Qur'an.
The tradition tells us that the third caliph, Uthman, ordered a standardization of the Quranic text. This was around 651 CE, roughly 20 years after Muhammad's death. Why did he do that? What was the problem?
Well, the empire had spread incredibly quickly. You had Muslims in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Persia, and according to the traditional accounts, variations in how the Quran was being recited, and maybe even slight differences in written copies, were starting to cause disputes in these new provincial centers.
Differences that could potentially undermine unity.
Exactly. A fragmented revelation could lead to a fragmented empire. So Uthman reportedly appointed a committee led by Zayd ibn Thabit, who had been one of Muhammad's own scribes, with a crucial task:
to create one official version.
To compile a master copy, the Uthmanic Codex or recension. They gathered existing materials, compared them, and produced a definitive text.
So they weren't writing it from scratch, but they were making editorial choices. Selecting, standardizing spelling, ordering the chapters, surahs.
Precisely. It was an editorial process based on the materials believed to go back to the Prophet. And once they had this master codex, Uthman ordered authorized copies sent out to the major cities of the empire, places like Kufa, Basra, Damascus.
And what about the other versions that were out there? The ones causing the disputes?
The tradition says he ordered them to be destroyed, burned.
Wow. That's a decisive act of centralization.
It absolutely is. For historians, it underscores that the Qur'an text we have today, while undoubtedly rooted in the language, style, and themes of 7th century Arabia and Muhammad's preaching, is also the product of a specific state-sponsored editorial project undertaken about 2 decades after his death. Its purpose was theological and political unity. #B. Shaping the Prophet's narrative.
Okay, so the revelation gets standardized early on. But the stories about the Prophet, the sīra, and the hadith, that took much longer, leaving that big chronological gap we talked about.
Right, and that gap, that 100 to 200 years, becomes crucial. It's the period when the narrative of the Prophet's life and sayings was really shaped and elaborated.
How did that happen? What was driving it?
A major driver was the needs of the later empire, particularly the Abbasid Caliphate, which came to power in 750 CE. They were building sophisticated legal and administrative systems for a vast, complex society. They needed answers to questions Muhammad likely never encountered.
Like complex inheritance laws, rules for irrigation, urban planning,
Yeah.
stuff that wasn't an issue in 7th century Medina.
Exactly. And where do you get the ultimate authority for a ruling in Islamic law? You trace it back to the Prophet. So there was an immense incentive, conscious or unconscious, to find or even generate sayings or actions of the Prophet Hadith that addressed these later concerns. This is called retrojection, projecting later needs back onto the founding figure.
So the memory of the Prophet became this incredibly useful resource, almost a living database, for solving contemporary problems.
Yes. It served as the ultimate source of legal precedent, ethical guidance, and political legitimacy. If you could support your legal opinion or your political claim with a hadith attributed to the Prophet, your argument was much stronger. This fueled the collection, circulation, and inevitably, sometimes the fabrication of hadith reports.
Which led to a problem. How do you know which reports are genuine? How do you sort the wheat from the chaff?
That led to the development of a really fascinating and unique methodology, the isnad system.
The chain of transmitters. Tell us how that worked.
The idea was that every hadith report, the actual saying or story called the matn, had to be accompanied by its chain of transmission, the isnad. This chain listed, in reverse order, everyone who had supposedly passed the report down, starting from the collector, like al-Bukhari in the 9th century, all the way back, ideally, to a companion who heard it directly from Muhammad.
And scholars like Bukhari didn't just collect these, they scrutinized the chains.
Immensely. They developed a whole science of biographical evaluation, ilm al-riyal. They'd investigate each narrator in the chain. Was he known to be truthful? Did he have a good memory? Crucially, could he have actually met the person he claimed to hear the report from? Did their lifespans overlap? Did they live in the same region? It was incredibly detailed work.
That sounds quite rigorous, actually, trying to establish authenticity.
It was, for its time. But here's the historical caveat. Scholars became very good at checking the formal soundness of the chain, the isnad, but a perfectly sound chain could still transmit content, the matnam, that might actually reflect a later issue.
So a strong chain doesn't automatically guarantee the story itself dates back to Muhammad's time.
Not necessarily. Some scholars even became suspicious of chains that looked too perfect, suggesting they might have been artificially constructed later to give authority to a particular viewpoint. The focus was often more on the piety and reliability of the transmitters than on critically analyzing the content for potential anachronisms.
This really highlights that difference between historical memory and, well, maybe historical fact. We saw that early external source, the Doctrina Jacobi, describing Muhammad as a prophet who comes with a sword, a militant image.
Contrast that with the powerful themes that develop strongly within the later sīra and hadith literature. emphasizing Muhammad's immense mercy, his wisdom, his patience, his forgiveness. Think about the idealized narrative of the peaceful conquest of Mecca.
Two different portraits.
And the later portrait, the one emphasizing mercy and perfect virtue, became absolutely essential. It shaped the image of the prophet needed to serve as the ultimate moral exemplar for a vast, established Islamic civilization. The memory evolved to meet the needs and ideals of the later community. #C, the monumental declaration of belief.
While the scholars and storytellers were shaping the internal narrative, the rulers, especially the Umayyad caliphs before the Abbasids, were making very public statements about the new faith and their authority. We see this in official documents and buildings.
Yes. We have administrative papyri from Egypt, for example. There's one called P. Nisana 77 from the 680s. It's basically a tax document or administrative letter.
What does it say that's relevant?
It assures the local, likely Christian population of the protection of God and the guarantee of his messenger. This shows the prophet's authority being formally invoked in the day-to-day running of the state, specifically in the context of granting protection, dima, to non-Muslim subjects. It also warns officials against corruption, showing a concern for governance under this banner.
But the most spectacular example of this public declaration has to be the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built when? In 691-692 CE.
Yes, by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. It's arguably the first great monumental statement of the new Islamic civilization, built right on the Temple Mount, a hugely significant spot for Jews and Christians.
It's not just a building, it's a message, isn't it? What do the inscriptions inside tell us?
They are incredibly revealing. They are among the earliest extensive Quranic quotations used in an architectural context. They strongly proclaim Islam's core tenets. Absolute monotheism, say, He is God the One, and they explicitly declare, Muhammad is the servant of God and his messenger.
Placing him firmly in the prophetic line, but as servant and messenger.
Correct. But it goes further. The inscriptions also directly address Christians, the people of the book. They quote Quranic passages warning them not to exaggerate in their religion by saying, God has a son. Far be it from his glory that he should have a son.
Wow, that's a direct theological challenge, carved in mosaic inside a massive monument in Jerusalem.
It's an incredibly bold assertion of Islamic identity and theological claims, aimed squarely at the established Christian community and Byzantine imperial tradition. It shows that within 60 years of Muhammad's death, the caliphate felt confident enough to make these monumental public declarations, defining itself against its predecessors and rivals.
And the timing is key too, right? Wasn't Abd al-Malik facing a rival caliph in Mecca at the time?
He was. Ibn al-Zubayr controlled Mecca and the Kaaba during the Second Civil War. So building this magnificent structure in Jerusalem, adorned with these powerful inscriptions, was also a political act by Abd al-Malik. It asserted his legitimacy, potentially offered an alternative pilgrimage focus, and firmly planted the Umayyad banner and ideology in a historically crucial city.
Okay, we've laid out the evidence. The solid historical core, backed by external and material sources, and then this large body of later narrative, the sīra and hadith, which needs critical reading because it's shaped by memory and later needs.
A complex picture.
So how do scholars actually put this all together? When faced with this mix of evidence, how do they weigh it? There seem to be different approaches, different models for interpreting it all.
That's right. Scholars debate how much weight to give each type of source. We can broadly outline maybe 4 main scenarios or perspectives.
Let's start with what might be called the traditionalist view. This is generally closer to the narrative accepted within the Islamic tradition itself.
Generally, yes. The traditionalist perspective tends to accept the broad historical outline provided by the sīra and hadith as substantially reliable. They'd say, yes, Muhammad lived in Mecca, migrated to Medina, unified Arabia through specific campaigns, and the accounts we have, while maybe containing some embellishments, preserve the essential history.
How do they view the rigor of the hadith collectors like Bukhari?
They see the isnad criticism developed by scholars like Bukhari and Muslim in the 9th century as a robust historical method that successfully filtered out most unreliable or fabricated reports. For them, the canonical hadith collections are largely trustworthy historical sources. External, non-Islamic sources are seen mostly as useful corroboration, but secondary to the internal tradition.
Okay, but then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, the revisionist challenge.
Right. The revisionists, particularly prominent in some Western academic circles from the 1970s onwards, take a much more skeptical stance, focusing heavily on that chronological gap.
Their argument is basically, if the detailed stories are written down centuries later, how can we possibly trust them as history?
That's the core of it. They emphasize the lack of contemporary Islamic narrative sources. They point to the clear political and theological motives of the Abbasid era when the sīra and hadith were codified. Some revisionists went quite far, questioning fundamental aspects of the traditional story, suggesting maybe Muhammad's role was inflated later, or even questioning the traditional location of Mecca, suggesting Islam might have originated elsewhere.
But what did the revisionists do with that early external evidence? The Doctrina Jacobi naming a prophet in 634, the rapid conquests confirmed by multiple sources, the coins and inscriptions.
That's generally seen as the biggest challenge for the more extreme revisionist theories. While they raise valid and important methodological questions about relying solely on late sources, they often struggle to convincingly explain the sheer speed and coherence of the early Islamic state and its conquests, which are attested early and externally. You need a powerful explanation for why the Byzantine and Persian empires crumbled so quickly, and a unifying figure like Muhammad provides that.
Okay, so between the traditionalist acceptance and the revisionist skepticism, is there a middle ground?
Yes, there's an approach often called the memory and myth emphasis. This perspective doesn't necessarily reject the sīra and hadith, but reads them differently.
How so?
It focuses on how communal memory works. It accepts the basic historicity of Muhammad and the core events, but sees the rich details, the specific dialogues, the miracle stories, not as literal history, but as products of how a community remembers, interprets, and gives meaning to its past. These narratives serve vital functions, teaching morals, establishing identity, explaining the Qur'an, but those functions are different from strict historical reporting.
So they'd say the Battle of Badr definitely happened, that's historical, but the elaborate stories about angels helping the Muslims might be later embellishments expressing the theological significance of the victory.
Exactly. It's about understanding the genre and purpose of the texts. They are literature of faith and memory first, historical chronicles second.
Which brings us to maybe the most common approach among historians today, a kind of synthesis.
Yes, what we could call the integrated or compromised scenario. This is probably where most mainstream scholarship lands now. It tries to integrate all the evidence seriously.
How does it do that?
It fully accepts Muhammad's historicity. It accepts his role as the founder of Islam and the leader who unified Arabia. It takes the early external sources and the material evidence, the inscriptions, the coins, as primary anchors for establishing the basic historical framework and chronology.
And the sīra and hadith?
It uses them, but critically. It reads them acknowledging the chronological gap and the processes of memory formation and potential retrojection. It tries to sift through them, looking for elements that seem historically plausible or might preserve earlier traditions, while remaining skeptical of details that seem clearly shaped by later theology or politics. It recognizes them as invaluable sources for understanding how Muslims understood the prophet, but not as infallible historical records.
So it's about acknowledging both the definite historical figure and the complex process by which his story was told and retold.
Precisely. It affirms the historical core while appreciating the layers of interpretation and meaning added over time. It seems the most balanced way to handle the diverse and sometimes contradictory evidence we have. It allows us to see Muhammad as both a figure who made history and a figure whose memory was made by history. #OutroE.
This really has been a deep dive into the sources and methods. So let's try to pull together the main takeaway.
I think the central finding is pretty clear. Muhammad was absolutely a real historical figure. His existence, his leadership, the unification of Arabia under his banner, and the incredibly rapid expansion of his followers immediately after his death, these core facts are solidly corroborated. We have contemporary external accounts, we have early inscriptions, we have coins. The political reality he created is undeniable. But the rich, detailed biographies, the sīra, and the vast corpus of hadith reports, while essential for understanding Islamic faith and practice, are largely products of a later time. They reflect an evolving memory, shaped over decades and centuries by the theological, legal, and political needs of the growing Islamic civilization.
So the job of critical scholarship isn't to dismiss these traditions.
Not at all. It's to understand them for what they are. Complex works of memory, faith, and literature that tell us as much about the communities that produce them as they do about the historical events themselves.
Okay, that leaves us with a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. We've established this picture, a historical core surrounded by layers of narrative and memory.
Right. And the really cutting-edge research now isn't really debating whether Muhammad existed. That's settled for historians. The challenge is getting more precise about modeling how that memory transmission worked over time. How do we carefully separate the earliest layers from the later additions?
How are scholars trying to do that?
Well, one fascinating area is using quantitative methods. For instance, computer analysis of the isnad networks. You have hundreds of thousands of these chains of transmission for hadith. By mapping them statistically, researchers can look for patterns.
Like bottlenecks.
Exactly. They might find, say, hundreds of different chains for a particular hadith, all suddenly converging on a single narrator living in, perhaps, Kufa in the mid-8th century. That statistical pattern strongly suggests the report likely originated with that person or around that time and place, rather than tracing authentically all the way back to the Prophet 200 years earlier. It doesn't automatically mean the content is false, but it suggests it reflects the concerns or legal thought of that later period.
So it's using big data to test the traditional claims of transmission.
Precisely. It's applying new tools to these old texts. It shows that this field, understanding the origins of Islam and the figure of Muhammad, is still incredibly dynamic and evolving. There's still so much to learn by critically engaging with all the evidence we have.